Aloha from Honolulu. Welcome to this webinar sponsored by the East-West Center. This webinar is part of the East-West Center Research Speaker Series. This series explores the environmental, demographic, political, and economic processes that are reshaping the Asia-Pacific region. Our topic for today is Evangelical Protestants and U.S. foreign policy, U.S. policy toward China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Our speaker today is Professor Kyung-Ho Jung, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of British Columbia. His research interests include legislative politics, American and comparative, and in particular, he's interested in how the U.S. Congress makes decisions on political policies, including civil rights, immigration, trade, and foreign policy issues. He's also interested in foreign policy more generally, political economy, and the legislative politics of South Korea. We have 1 hour total for our webinar. We'll start with a lecture by Dr. Jung, which will be followed by a question and answer session. If you want to ask a question, look at the bottom of your screen, find the link for Q&A, click on it, it will open a dialog box. You can type your question in there, we'll see it, and we'll try to get to it. Dr. Jung.
All right, thank you. Okay, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity to present my work. Okay, let me share the screen and get started. All right. Okay, so let me start with a simple question. I think that everybody should know the answer to the question. So Republican Party, they support restricting abortion in the US. And the simple question is why they do that. I mean, there could be many answers, but one of the key thing about that is it's evangelical Christian. I mean, because that's what they want. The next question is then why do Republican Party represent evangelicals? I mean, they could choose not to represent them. And the answer to that actually comes from this picture. Okay. I mean, this map shows the distribution of evangelicals across the US. And this dark red state represent the high concentration of evangelicals. And as you can see, they are mostly in the South and Midwest. Okay. And the South and Midwest, they are the basis of the Republican Party. Okay. And you can see the connection clearly from this picture. This is another picture from 2008. And this is based on the exit poll. And the numbers there represent the proportion of Republican voters who identify as evangelicals. So for example, in Alabama, 77% of Republicans, they identify as evangelicals. And Texas, 6% of the Republicans, they identify as the evangelical. And those states who don't have the data, it's just like we don't have the evangelical, it's just we don't have the data, that's it, okay? So what we see here is that in the South and Midwest, there are a lot of evangelical voters and they associate them as Republican voters. And that's why we see a picture like this. And this is the picture that shows as of this December, last December, the states that ban abortion or have restrictions on abortion. And again, they are heavily in the South and Midwest. Okay. So now, let's move on to the foreign policy side. Let me start with a simple question. I mean, last year we saw during the Israel-Hamas war, Democratic Party was divided, but Republican Party was unified in support of Israel. And why is that case? And again, the same answer. It's because evangelical Christians. I mean, there could be other factors, but the way I see it is that it's mostly because evangelicals support Israel. And then the question is, then why evangelicals support Israel? It's mainly because of their beliefs. They believe that the complete restoration of Israel actually is one of the conditions for the second coming of Jesus Christ. Okay. And this is not just the belief shared by the evangelical leaders, actually. The evangelical voters actually believe that as well. So according to a survey done by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, it was done in July last year. This is the number that shows the support Israel's military actions during the Israel-Hamas war. As you can see, evangelical Protestants, they are overwhelmingly in support of Israel. Okay. So what we see is that the evangelicals have a significant influence on domestic policy, like social cultural policies in the UN. They also have a significant influence on the Israel or Middle East policy. That brings me the question that I'm asking today. So, do evangelical influence extend beyond Israel and Middle East, the Middle East? That's my question. Okay. And this answer to this question actually is not simple. Okay. And here I'm asking actually two different questions. First, I'm asking whether the evangelicals will care about issues not related to Israel or Middle East. Okay. And the next question is, even when they care, I mean, will they make any difference? Just like the abortion or Israel policies? Okay. I mean, the answer to this second question actually is not obvious because many studies on public opinion on foreign policy shows that there's a significant disconnect between public opinion and the actual policy outcome. Okay. I mean, they have a good reasons why there will be a significant disconnect. And mostly the voters care more about domestic issues unless there's a major war. And also, there are not many interest groups active on foreign policy unless you are dealing with foreign trade. Okay? So because of that, the members of Congress or at least they have some discretion to make foreign policy. I mean, that's the common view by the existing study. On the other hand, there's a ground actually that evangelicals actually might be different. Okay? First of all, evangelicals, they are well organized, at least since late 1970s. So they had powerful leaders like Jerry Powell, and they had a strong organization called Moral Majority. So they mobilized the evangelical voters to register to vote. And also they lobbied on behalf of them in Congress and in White House. Okay. And this moral majority actually, they had some goals. And two of the major goals of this organization actually relate to the foreign policy issues. So one of them is the strong US defense. And the other one is the support for Israel. Okay. So given that, there's ground, actually the evangelicals might care more about the foreign policy than any other group. And also we actually have some cases where they made a significant difference in terms of the policy outcome. So for example, in 90s, during Clinton administration, they lobbied Congress to pass the International Religious Freedom Act. I mean, that was in response to Chinese government persecution of Christians. Okay. And also they lobbied Congress to block the US participation in the UN Population Fund. Basically, this is the initiative on birth control and population control. Okay. And also they lobbied Congress to restrict the use of federal funds for international organizations that provide any type of abortion services. Okay, so these are some of the examples where evangelicals actually made a big difference on foreign policy. Okay. But we don't have any systematic evidence except except some cases that the evangelicals actually make some difference in foreign policy beyond Israel and Middle East. So that's what I'm trying to see in this research. Okay. Before I go further, let me just briefly highlight some of the key characteristics of evangelical Protestants. I mean, how they are different from mainline Protestants. The existing studies point out two things. The first one is their strict adherence to the Bible. Okay. So they have a tendency to actually take the words in the Bible quite seriously. Okay. So for example, many of them believe before the second coming of Christ, there will be Armageddon. Basically the battle between the armies of the God and armies of the evil. Okay. So they take it actually quite seriously on that. And another key unique thing about the evangelicals is that they emphasize the individual conversion, which is called the born-again experience. Okay. And that actually quite consistent with the conservative values because it emphasized individual responsibility and the personal morality. So this is the main characteristics of the evangelical Protestants. And how does that translate into their view on foreign policy? But first of all, they tend to look at the world politics as a struggle between the good and evil. I mean, the good example of this is the George W. Bush remark on the axis of evil. And even before him, many leaders of the evangelicals, like Billy Graham, they consider the communist countries as the evil regimes. That's one. And also they believe that the Armageddon actually is the precondition for the second coming of Christ. And that means battle between the US and any adversaries actually is justified because of that prophecy. Okay. So some key figures of the evangelicals, like Pat Robertson, actually they openly call for the military attacks on Iran. Okay. For them, it's not just justified, it is a requirement. Military action against Iran actually is a requirement for the second coming of Christ. So given all this, we can expect that the evangelicals will have more hawkish stance on the foreign policy. And there are actually studies that look at the public opinion surveys, and then they found that the evangelical voters, they are more likely to support hawkish foreign policy, like more spending on defense, and they are strongly in favor of the Israel and things like that. So we have evidence that evangelicals actually support hawkish foreign policy. But what we don't have is actually the evidence that their view actually matters. Okay. So this is the paper's topic, okay? So their hawkish view actually will be reflected in foreign policy making decisions. Okay. To do that, in this research, I'm going to look at the evangelicals' connection on their legislators' voting behavior on adversarial states. And here I focus on 5 states: China, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Okay. The reason I focus on the US policy on adversarial state actually is because, I mean, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, dealing with these adversaries actually became one of the key issues in US foreign policy. Okay. And it's just not one-time thing. I mean, throughout the post-Cold War period, dealing with these countries actually became one of the key things that you have to actually do this. Okay. So for example, North Korea, in the early 90s, they started having this nuclear development. And that became a topic for the US foreign policy quite a long. Okay. And China also has been on the agenda of US foreign policy for a long time. At the beginning, it was the issue about Taiwan. And these days, it is issues about trade, economic sanctions, and more about the safeguarding the sensitive technology against China in those days. And Russia these days is about the war in Ukraine, or those days. Okay. So dealing with this adversarial state actually is one of the key things in the US foreign policy. And by the way, some of you might point out that the relationship with China and Russia was not always antagonistic. I mean, that's true, but for evangelicals, they could have a different opinion. Okay. So that's why I chose these 5 states. Okay. All right. So given this research design, the first thing I do is to collect the data. I collected all the house data. I looked at it from 1993 and up to 2022. I collected all house votes on each of these states. Okay. And by the way, I focus on the House because the senators, they represent the state, not the House district. And also they have a 6-year term. So because of that, the connection between voters and the senator actually is less condensed. Okay. So that's why I focus on the House. I also just look at the votes that are directly related to each of these states. So, for example, I don't collect the national defense authorization vote because that includes a lot of issues. Only when the vote is directly related to each of these states, then I count as one of the data. And so, after collecting this and then excluding some of the unanimous vote, because unanimous vote, I don't have any information about how members actually they were different. So that leaves me with 72 votes on China, 44 votes on Cuba, 70 votes on Iran, and 28 votes on North Korea, and 50 votes on Russia. So I have enough data to analyze the members' position on this stage. And this vote actually, by the way, covers a lot of issues, but mainly they deal with issues like economic sanctions or trade, or the next common theme is the human rights violation of these states. Okay. And more recently, I mean, there are issues about the safeguarding some sensitive technologies from this state. And to give you a sense, this is the annual distribution of the votes on China issue. And I disaggregated by the issue type. So this is the total number. And there are some votes on human rights represented by blue rectangle here. And there are some votes on trade. And earlier they had some votes on Taiwan-related issues. Okay. And then there was some vote about the abortion because China had the one-child policy for a while. So there are many different issues, and there's a variation across the time. And another thing is the bipartisanship on this vote. Okay. And here I just counted a vote as bipartisan if 50% or more of Democrats and Republicans voted in the same direction. Okay. So this blue line represents the number of bipartisan votes. So in general, I mean, there's a strong bipartisan consensus on the issues dealing with not just China, actually, many other adversarial states. And these red dots represent the number of unanimous votes. So that indicate even some bipartisan votes, the vote was not unanimous. So that allows me actually to analyze the members' difference on this each of these states. All right. So next data that I need to analyze the relationship between the evangelicals and member position on each state is to have data on evangelicals at the House district level. Okay. For that, I collected data from the US religious census. Okay. And then this is actually, they provide county level data. So I use some population-based crosswalk to transform this data into district level data. And finally, I mean, this data provide the religious denomination. Okay? And so to classify these denominations into evangelical versus mainline Protestants, I have to rely on some of the classification. And this is actually one of the popular classification in the existing studies. And so that's how I got the evangelical data. And my expectation is that the member who represent more evangelicals in their district, they are more likely to have a aggressive stance on each of these adversarial states. Okay. And I mean, the model that I use to analyze this vote, I'm going to actually skip. I want to highlight that this model actually is useful to allow me to analyze multiple votes. There are, as you saw, I mean, there are a lot of votes. So this model allows me to use multiple votes at the same time to estimate individual legislatures' position on each state. And also, at the same time, it allows me to estimate the relationship between the share of evangelicals and members' position on each of the states. And also, finally, it takes into account the difference across votes because some votes are more salient than others. And this model allows actually to control for that. Okay. All right. So, I mean, if you're interested, you can look at that in the paper. Okay. So let me show you some the result. So this is actually the graph shows the 20 most hawkish members on China and 20 most dovish members on China. The x-axis of this graph represents the score in terms of the hawkish stance on China. So this legislature on the right side, they are top 20 hawkish legislatures. And so the most hawkish legislature in China is Wesley Watkins, and he's a Republican from Oklahoma. And the number in the first bracket represents the share of evangelicals in his district. So he represents a district with 54% of evangelicals in his district. Okay. And the number in the second bracket represents the share of the China-born population in his district, because this is the issue about the China, so I actually added that information. Okay. So what we see is that if you look at the top 20, the hawkish members, they have a quite large representation of evangelicals in their district. On average, actually, the share of evangelicals in their district is 34%. Okay. They have almost 0% of China-born population in their district. Now, let's move on to the top 20 dovish members on China. As you can see, the percentage of evangelicals in their district is barely more than 10%. In fact, on average, they have only 7% of evangelicals in their district. And they have some modest number of China-born population in these districts. Okay. So you see that this difference between the hawkish members and dovish members in terms of the share of evangelicals in their district. Now, this is the result on Cuba. Now, if you look at the average, the top 20 hawkish members on Cuba, their average share of evangelical is actually 28%, compared to the top 20 dovish members who had on average 5% of evangelicals in their district. I mean, compared to the China, the difference in terms of the share of evangelical is not that big, but you will see why. Let's look at the top 3 hawkish members on Cuba. And if you look at their share of evangelical, it's less than 10%. But look at the share of Cuba-born population in their district. It's more than 20%. It's quite significant. So what that tells us is that if you have more Cuban Americans in your district, then they are more likely to take hawkish stand on Cuba. But others, for example, Lindsey Graham, when he was the House members, and his district actually had 43% of evangelicals, and others too. So what we see here is that the top 20 hawkish members, they have a large population of Cuban Americans in their district or large population of evangelicals in their district. Okay. But for dovish members, they have less than 10% of the evangelicals in their district or almost no Cuban American. Okay. So I think that explains the difference between the Cuba and China. Now, move on to the Iran. We see the similar dynamic. So the share of evangelicals for hawkish members is 40%. But for the dovish members, it's only 8%. And we see the similar result for North Korea. On average, hawkish members had 42% of evangelicals in their district. Dovish members had only 8% of evangelicals in their district. And by the way, for Korean share, I mean, I use the South Korean born people because there are barely any North Korean born people in the US. Okay. And one thing I found really interesting is the Ron Paul was estimated to be the most hawkish against North Korea. And it doesn't make sense because we know Ron Paul is more like isolationist. So I was struggling to find out what happened, but I couldn't find the answer. But my suspicion is that he was voting against any type of foreign aid. Probably that might have made him more hawkish. But I need to check back on this. But I mean, other than him, we have a lot of the evangelical share in these hawkish members. And finally, Russia, we see the same dynamic. So on average, hawkish members have like 35% of evangelicals in their district. And dovish members have less than 10% of evangelicals in their district. Okay. So we see the pattern that the hawkish members, they are more likely to have large percentage of the evangelicals in their district. But the problem is, I mean, here we are not considering other factors. I mean, it could be a function of other factors. So what we need to do is actually we need to control for some confounding factors. So in the model, actually, I include some control variables. So the things that I include example, like the membership in House Foreign Affairs Committee or the House Armed Services Committee. The argument here is that, I mean, they will have more expertise on this issue, so they might actually have a different perspective on the issue. I also include the each member's veteran status. I mean, having experience in military can give them some different perspective on dealing with these adversaries. The seniority, the argument here is that if you have more experience in the Congress, then you have more expertise. So they might actually give you some different perspective on this issue. I include the number of military bases in the district. If you have more military bases, probably you are representing more hawkish voters in your district. And the Southern District, there are studies that shows that the voters in the South, they tend to be more hawkish on foreign policy, so that's why I include it. And also I include the select foreign-born population. So when I analyze the vote on China, I include the percentage of the China-born population. When I analyze vote on Cuba, I include the Cuba-born population size. Okay. And finally, I include the foreign policy ideology of the member. Probably this will be the most strong the predictor of their voting behavior on the adversaries. Okay. So let me show you the result. Okay. So I did that for each of the 5 states. In the first model of each state, this positive coefficient means that if you have greater share of evangelicals in your district, then you are more likely to have a more aggressive stance on the state. And that is the case in China, and that is the case in Cuba, Iran, Russia, North Korea. Okay, so this is consistent with my expectation. And another thing to note is actually the share of select foreign-born population. Actually, it's quite significant. So for example, this negative 0.04 represents that if you have more China-born population in your district, then they are more likely to be dovish on China. And that is the same for Iran, Russia, and North Korea. The exception is Cuba. If you have more Cuban Americans in your district, then the member will be more likely to be more hawkish toward Cuba, which is consistent because the Cuban Americans are known for supporting the more punitive policy against Cuba. Okay. All right. So that's the first model. And then in the second model, I include the foreign policy ideology. And first of all, the foreign policy ideology is significant and positive in all 5 states. That means more hawkish members, they are more likely to support more aggressive policy toward each of the states, which makes sense. Another thing is, when I include this foreign policy ideology, then the significance of the share of evangelicals actually go away, except for Cuba. So at this point, I was thinking, oh, maybe everything is determined by the members' foreign policy ideology, and share of evangelicals doesn't matter. But I didn't stop at that because I thought maybe that is the case, but there's alternative. The alternative argument here is that maybe the impact of evangelical actually is not direct. It could be indirect, in the sense that if you have more evangelical voters in your district, then they are more likely to elect more hawkish members, or they might actually push their legislature to take more hawkish stance on foreign policy in general. And then this hawkish members, they are likely to support more aggressive stance toward each of these adversarial states. Okay? And we have evidence, this is the second part. This is the evidence of the second part. Okay? And we don't have evidence for the first part, whether the evangelical actually push members of Congress to take more hawkish foreign policy ideology. So I'm going to actually check that possibility in the next. And for that, actually, I divide the data set into 3 different periods. Okay. I'll explain why I divide that. First of all, the U.S. religious census, and then U.S. census, actually, they are collected every 10 years. And also the U.S. House district, they are redistricted every 10 years. And then this redistricted House districts are actually implemented at the beginning of every decade. Okay. So it actually allows us to actually see this temporal variation in the share of the evangelical. And then we can compare how that affects members' foreign policy ideology. Okay. All right. So for that, I do another analysis. Now the dependent variable is the members' ideology, foreign policy ideology. And I'm going to skip this part. But the key thing is, in that model, I include actually the members' fixed effects. That means everything that doesn't change over time for member actually will be controlled by these fixed effects. That include members' own religious tradition. Because some religious legislation might actually follow their religion instead of their voters' religion. So to prevent that, I control for the members' own religious beliefs using fixed effects. And another thing is, instead of the select foreign-born population, I include total foreign-born population in the district, because we are now dealing with members' foreign policy ideology. Okay. So that's it. So here, the table shows the result of this analysis. Okay. Again, the dependent variable is members' foreign policy position, the ideology. And here we see the share of evangelicals have a positive impact across different models. That means if you have more evangelicals in your district, then members are more likely to take more hawkish foreign policy ideology. Okay. Before I move on, one other thing that is to note is that the share of foreign-born population has a negative impact across 3 different models. That means if you have more foreign-born population in your district, then the member is more likely to have dovish foreign policy ideology, which is, I find that it's quite interesting. Okay. So to give an example, I selected a few the House members to illustrate the impact here. Okay. So Steve Chabot, a Republican from Ohio. So over the 3 decades, the share of the evangelicals in his district actually has increased from 8% to 20%. I mean, part of that is because of redistricting. Okay. And that resulted in his foreign policy ideology becoming more hawkish. I mean, this number doesn't mean a lot to you. So to give you a sense, what I did was I just found the ranking in terms of how much they are hawkish. Okay. So when he had 1.94 score, that made him like a 68 percentile. But when his foreign policy ideology, the hawkish score increased, then made him 86 percentile. So he became more hawkish, quite a lot. And another member, this is the Democrat from Tennessee. So over the 3 decades, the share of evangelicals in his district shrunk from 45% to 33%. And that resulted in him being more dovish. Okay. So in terms of the ranking, he was before he was almost in the median, in the center. But these days he is more dovish in terms of foreign policy. Okay. I mean, Republican being more hawkish, Democrats being more dovish. It sounds like a trend, like a polarization. But actually, the change in the evangelical share actually can drive members to the center. Okay. And here is another example of that. So Gene Green, a Democrat from Texas, so over the 3 decades, the share of evangelicals in his district actually increased. Not a lot, but small amount of increase. But then made him more hawkish. Okay. So in terms of ranking, so he was 38th percentile before, but these days he's 41st percentile. And Republican from Texas. And he represents quite a Republican safe state of the district, but still, over the 3 decades, I mean, there was some changes in terms of the share of evangelicals. Okay. And that actually resulted in his foreign policy ideology being more dovish. Okay. So in terms of ranking, previously he was really hawkish members, but these days he moved toward to the more center. Okay. So that shows that the share of evangelical actually can affect members' foreign policy ideology. Okay. So combining this result, which shows that a greater share of evangelicals actually will push members to take more hawkish foreign policy. And the earlier result that more hawkish members, they are more likely to support more aggressive stance on each of the states. We see the combined, the indirect impact of the evangelicals. Okay. I think it's almost time. So I'm gonna skip this part. So let me summarize, okay? So what we see is that the evangelicals, they affect the US foreign policy toward the adversarial state, but their impact actually is not direct. It's indirect, in the sense that they affect the ideology of their members. And that ideology of members actually drive their stance on each of these adversarial states. So what are the takeaway points? First, now we have evidence that shows that evangelicals' influence actually go beyond the Israel and the Middle East. Even the policy on the adversarial states, it can be affected by evangelicals. And another point is that the evangelicals actually they are one of the few groups that can actually affect the legislatures and their behavior on foreign policy. And the other group who affects the legislatures and their foreign policy behavior actually is the foreign population. I mean, they work against the evangelicals because they drive their members to be more hawkish, more dovish actually, dovish. And the only exception here is that the Cuban Americans, they are the exception in the sense that they drive their members to be more hawkish on Cuba. Okay. Yeah, actually, I'm gonna stop here. I think we're about time, right?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zhang. So we're now ready to begin the question and answer session until we reach the end of the hour. I remind you again that you can submit a question by opening the dialog box at the bottom of the screen under Q&A. So I guess I'll ask the first question. Dr. Zhang, I'm going to offer a potential criticism of your argument and give you a chance to respond.
Okay.
So you're arguing that evangelicals in the U.S. can have a significant impact on foreign policy, and that would be an interesting finding. But I noticed that when you put up the charts of the top 20 on each side on the various issues that mixed in there were some districts that had a pretty low percentage of evangelicals. Some were high, some were not so high, but the representatives took hawkish positions. So I'm wondering if one could argue that what you're really seeing is you're kind of indirectly getting at the real driver, which would be people being conservative. So in other words, conservative people with conservative views are driving the hawkish policies. If you look only at evangelicals, because there's a large overlap between evangelicals and conservative views, you will get part of it, but you would actually explain the phenomenon better if you would just simply look for people with conservative views. which would result in a finding that conservative people tend to have hawkish views, which is not nearly as interesting a finding. It's kind of an obvious finding. What would be your response?
Right. I mean, so that's right. I mean, I think when I included the members' foreign policy ideology and the influence of the evangelical actually goes away. I think it's the same in the sense that the more conservative people, they are more likely to take more hawkish positions, right? So I think that's why I actually I originally I was thinking that the evangelicals will have a more direct impact on members' position on foreign policies, but now I see there's more like indirect impact. Okay, so if you have more evangelical voters in your district, then they are more likely to drive their members to take more conservative or hawkish positions in general in terms of ideology. And then based on their ideology, they are more likely to choose more aggressive stance on each of those states, right? So I think what I'm saying is consistent with your argument that it's more about the ideology. But my point here is what I'm adding is that then how do you explain their change in terms of ideology, whether it is the conservatism or hawkishness? My point is that the voters, the evangelical voters, actually they actually do have an impact on the type of the ideology they have, their legislature have. Does it make sense?
Okay. Next question. One of the members of the audience asked if it's possible to get a copy of your presentation, particularly getting the figures on the number of evangelicals in different districts.
Sure,
Is there
I
a
can
way
make
to
that
make this?
available. Yes, yes.
Okay. Another asks if you would define the term evangelicals and why you think it's useful to characterize the audience you look at that way.
Right. I mean, in the literature, there's a debate about how do we categorize the religious denominations. And I simply follow the most commonly used approach, which is to distinguish the mainline Protestants and then evangelical Protestant. And in one of the slides, I mentioned that this is one of the commonly used classification of religious denomination into mainline versus the evangelical. I simply follow that. But I mean, the key thing here is that the main thing when we call somebody evangelical, they have two unique characteristics. One is that they believe in the Bible. They take the word in the Bible as seriously. That's one of the key things. And they also emphasize the born again experience. So it's individual who has to convert to Christian, okay, to be saved. Okay. I think that actually is the main distinction between the like a mainline Protestants and then evangelical Protestant.
I wonder if there's some interesting movement in the case of Russia as an indication of a hawkish foreign policy topic, in that the way conservatives and probably evangelicals viewed Russia, say in the 1980s, might be quite different in recent years, where you know, a lot of supporters of President Trump would be possibly a little bit more sympathetic about some aspects of Russia. You know, that Russia is an example of anti-wokeness, for example. So do you see a kind of movement in a kind of shifting of views in recent years?
I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, my data actually doesn't allow me to see that because it stopped at 2022. But what I realized is that the evangelicals, because of evangelicals, actually, President Trump actually has really limited discretion on the issue of Iran. And also on the issue of Cuba, he had really, really limited discretion because of the Cuban American. And Trump actually, he lives in the Florida, so he knows how much Cuban Americans are against any type of the normalization of relationship with Cuba. So I don't think Trump had any discretion on the issue of Cuba and Iran. But on other issues like North Korea and China and Russia, I mean, if we accept the notion that Trump actually supports more isolationist foreign policy, then that's the place where he will have more discretion. I mean, in his first term, he tried to make any negotiation with North Korea. And he got along with Russia, right? And he didn't do that any of that with Iran and Cuba. And so I think mainly because of the evangelical strong position on Israel and also the strong dominance of the Cuban American in Florida. Okay. So my point is that out of these 5 states, yeah, Trump will have more room to any maneuver among these 3 states, China, Russia, and North Korea. That I can say, but other than that, I mean, yeah, I mean, because of Trump, actually the evangelical voters or his base actually might see Russia and even North Korea in different ways. Actually, that's possible, but I don't think that will happen to Iran and Cuba at least.
Next question. Do you think there would be a higher percentage of evangelical type views or evangelical attitudes toward foreign policy in the U.S. armed forces than in the U.S. population generally?
It's a difficult question. I mean, my research is more about evangelical themselves and then how their view will be shared by other sections of the U.S. I'm not sure, but I mean, if we assume that the leader, like President Trump, will have some impact on other sections of the U.S., probably his more friendly gesture toward the evangelical, or more recently the Israel, I think that will be more spread other sections of the U.S. for sure. But how much, I'm not sure. Yeah, to be honest.
And another question, which is similar to the one I asked, if you measured the different, if you divide up the U.S. population by party membership, and then ran the same kind of exercise that you have here, would you get similar results, or in what way would they be different?
My sense is that it will be similar because when I estimated the foreign policy ideology, it was highly correlated with their domestic the ideology. So I guess that will be correlated with the I guess, for example, Republican President Bush share in the district. Okay, that kind of measures the conservativeness of the district, right? So I expect to see the same thing, similar thing.
Another question about the armed forces, you may or may not know the answer. Is participation in the armed forces higher, the rate of participation among evangelicals than non-evangelicals? Or what's your sense?
I'm not sure. I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, but my speculation is that I mean, there are studies that shows that the Southerners, they are more likely to have more loyalty and they are more likely to be hawkish against other countries. If actually that drives the people's incentive to join the army, probably then might be more happening in the South. And in the South, there are a lot of evangelicals, so it could be related. Yeah, but I don't have the answer.
Okay. That might be your next project.
Yeah.
There's currently no line in the question and answer box if anyone is thinking about asking a question. Do you have a rough breakdown of how American evangelicals as a group by race, say percentage of Black versus percentage of white?
Yeah, because white here, when I call the evangelical voters, I was referring to white evangelical voters. So there's the existing studies that the white evangelicals and Black evangelicals, they are totally different in terms of their perspective. So here I just counted white evangelicals. Okay, so my argument only applies to the white evangelicals.
Okay, because I'm guessing that a large percentage or maybe a majority of Black evangelicals would vote Democratic Party often.
Right, and they will have a totally different ideology for sure. Yes.
Yeah. Roughly what percentage of the United States would you put in the category of white evangelicals, or the proportion, the percentage of U.S. voters, let's say?
I didn't actually look at the total the share of the total population. I just look at the distribution across the state. So
We look at your state's map, we can get some idea.
yeah. Let's look at the map. I think that might be okay. Share that. I don't have the option to share. Can I share the screen again or? Oh, here. Okay. So that's the map. So, I mean, none of the states has more than 50% of the evangelicals in the state. So, but these are the states that had about 30% of evangelicals. Yeah. I don't know how many that it could translate into the share of the total population.
Looks like, just very ballpark, looks like something like 20%, would you say?
Yeah, I guess, yes. Yeah, that could be a roughly good guess, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else want to ask a question? There's no line. If we have some dead air time, then I'll just end the session early.
Okay.
Any other points you wanted to make, but you feel like you didn't have time?
No, actually, the Q&A actually covers some of the slides that I had in the back, like policy implications. I mean, you touched on the Russia and China and other issues. I mean, that's what I had at the end. I mean, making predictions about how Trump and his ideology, the isolationist, the policy actually can be aligned with evangelicals. And my point was there's no room for any maneuvering on the issue of Iran and Cuba. But other three, he will definitely try to negotiate with them. Okay. And then the question is how that will affect the evangelicals beyond this state? That's another question, actually.
Okay. I have another request for your paper, asking whether it's available somewhere. Have you written this up in a published form?
Yeah, I actually, when I sent the draft, I didn't include all. I had some extra actually slide that I prepared for this presentation. So I can add them in the paper and then it'll be more complete, I guess, soon.
Okay. And folks can look for that in a academic journal somewhere?
Yeah, probably I will make them available on my website. If you go to the political science department, University of British Columbia, then you might find my website.
Okay, so go to UBC edu, is it?
Yes, right.
Okay.
UBC.actually CA, yeah.
Okay, we're close to our closing time and there are no more questions. So I'll say thank you, Dr. Jung. Let me thank also the East West Center staff who helped to make this webinar possible. And especially thanks to all of you who viewed and asked questions. This seminar is part of an ongoing series. We'll have more in the future. So please regularly check the East West Center website for future episodes. Until then, hui ho.